It's the end of May, 1863, and John Bell Hood is on the move to join Lee on the Rappahannock for the Army of Northern Virginia's move into Pennsylvania, which will lead to the Battle of Gettysburg. By June the 26th, Hood is once again crossing the Potomac River at Williamsport. And by June the 30th, they'll be in Chambersburg. Meanwhile, in Gettysburg, on the afternoon of July the 1st, Longstreet and Lee quarrel over Lee's battle plan. Lee wants to take the offensive immediately and have Longstreet's corps roll up the Union left flank down Emmitsburg Road. Longstreet has proposed a flanking maneuver around Little Round Top, a move towards Washington to find a good defensive position and force the Union to attack them. Lee is quoted as telling Longstreet, "I'm going to whip them or they're going to whip me," and the argument is settled. So when Hood arrived early on the morning of July the 2nd, after an all-night march, he meets with Lee and Longstreet and the plan is laid out. Longstreet wanted to wait for Pickett's division to show up before making the attack, so the decision was made to wait for Pickett to arrive. While waiting for Pickett, Hood found out from his scouts that there were no Union troops behind Little Round Top, and the left flank of the Union line was exposed. Hood wrote in his book, Advance and Retreat, that he made 3 attempts to get Longstreet to give him permission to attack around Little Round Top and turn the Union flank. 3 times he got the word from Longstreet that they would follow Lee's orders. And after John W. Fairfax from Longstreet's staff rode over late in the afternoon to tell him the same thing, Hood attacked.
Right, even at the beginning of the charge, there was a shell that exploded about 20 feet above him. It was a canister shell, and it almost ripped off his arm. And so he was out of the battle at the first, and that really had a big effect on the Texas Brigade. But John Bell Hood was wounded seriously, taken off the battle at the hospital. And he did say that, losing his brigade was worse than getting wounded in the arm. He said, "I needed to lead my men in battle, and that wounds me more deeply than what happened to me with my arm."
The wounded Hood was transported to Staunton, Virginia, along with Wade Hampton, who was also injured, where he remained under the care of Dr. Darby until early August. Hood spent most of August in Richmond courting Buck, while also seeing 16-year-old Louise Luley Wigfall, the daughter of Lewis and Charlotte Wigfall, who was infatuated with him. In late August 1863, Jefferson Davis decided to send part of Longstreet's First Corps south to reinforce Braxton Bragg's Army of the Tennessee. So as Hood's old brigade began arriving in Richmond for the trip south, Hood greeted his men at the train station, where they cheered him and convinced him that even with his arm in a sling, he should command them in Georgia. Hood had one thing he had to do before he could leave, though. He rode to Petersburg with Mrs. Chestnut and Buck, and before he boarded the train, he proposed to Buck, who had so many other proposals from other gentlemen in Richmond that she left Hood hanging, not giving him a yes or a no. But he rode away thinking he was engaged, and she not.
At the Battle of Chickamauga, General Lee and Jefferson Davis got together and said that Braxton Bragg needed to get some more reinforcements because of what happened with the Tullahoma campaign and Murfreesboro and all that. He really needed to get some more troops. And so Longstreet's corps was transferred to the Western Theater Army, Tennessee. And of course, John Bell Hood was the commander of the division. And they didn't arrive all at once. They arrived bits and pieces here and there. I don't know what would have happened if the whole Longstreet's corps would have showed up at once, but it didn't. And so Hood's Texas Brigade was relatively late at Chickamauga, and they were in a little bit on September 18th, 1863, a little bit more than on September 19th, 1863, but September 20th, they were really in the battle. And General Hood was leading the brigade effectively, as he always does in battle. However, he was shot in the leg, and it was always thought that he was probably shot by friendly fire. And Private Lawrence Stafford of the 4th Texas, decades after the battle, said that it was probably a soldier from the Florida Regiment that shot Hood, because he probably thought that Hood was a Union officer, because the Texas Brigade wore a brand new uniform from the Richmond Depot. After Gettysburg, they needed to get more new uniforms and more supplies, and so that's where they got them from Richmond. And John Bell Hood was wearing a uniform that the Army of Tennessee mistaken as for a Union officer, and so he was shot in the leg.
We're here at the Chickamauga National Battlefield, at the site where John Bell Hood was wounded. During the heat of the battle on September the 20th, General Jerome Robertson, who was commanding the Texas Brigade, rode over to Hood to get orders, just as Hood was shot in the right thigh. The ball shattered the bone, which meant the leg had to be amputated. Hood was moved to the home of one of his officers, Colonel Francis Little, who commanded the 11th Georgia. He spent a month there under the care of Little's parents, William and Elizabeth. When he was well enough to be moved, he was taken back to Richmond by way of Atlanta. Back in Richmond, even with one leg, Hood was the center of Richmond society. Dinners, card parties, receptions, and teas all included Hood. At Christmas dinner at the Prestons, which included the Chestnuts, John Breckinridge, and Simon Buckner, Hood was in a sullen mood. Mary Chestnut found out that Buck had turned down yet another proposal from Hood. But he persisted, and by February, Sally had relented and agreed to marry him. On February the 4th, 1864, Hood was promoted to lieutenant general, and on the 9th, he was ordered to join General Joe Johnston's army as a corps commander. When Hood arrived in Dalton, Georgia, he met with General Johnston and relayed a plan that Richmond had in mind: join Polk's army and Longstreet's corps on a march into Tennessee. Johnston was having none of it, and there began the enmity between Joe Johnston and John Bell Hood. Following a series of retreats, culminating in the unopposed crossing of the Chattahoochee River north of Atlanta, Jefferson Davis, on July the 17th, relieved Johnston of command and appointed Hood as the commander of the Army of Tennessee. Hood believes that the only way to defeat the enemy is with a series of attacking blows. Starting on July the 19th with the Battle of Peachtree Creek, then again with the Battle of Atlanta on July the 22nd, and finally on July the 26th at Ezra Church. Each one of the assaults is a defeat for Hood, and in the course of these three battles, he suffers more casualties than Johnston did in all of his retreats from Dalton, something that Hood later refutes in his book. But Sherman still isn't in Atlanta, so he decides to lay siege to the city. After the rail line from Macon fell into Union hands at Jonesboro on August the 31st, and his supply lines were severed, Hood pulled his troops out of Atlanta on September the 1st, destroying supply stores and torching 81 ammunition cars. Hood moved his troops to Lovejoy Station, south of Atlanta, and then on to Palmetto, where he had a meeting with Jefferson Davis on September the 25th. There, Hood laid out his plan to sever Sherman's communications lines and move towards Tennessee in the hope that Sherman would have to follow him. Atlanta in reverse. The strategy worked, with Sherman leaving a token force in Atlanta and pursuing Hood. Jefferson Davis had made some public speeches where he told the audience that Hood's plan was to disrupt communications lines and move to Tennessee, so Sherman knew what Hood's plans were already. But he gave up the chase when Hood turned left at Guntersville and returned to Atlanta. Hood would meet his old West Point classmate, General John Schofield, again at the Battle of Franklin. After Schofield's troops had slipped past the Confederates at Spring Hill on the night of November the 29th and 30th, they began to prepare defensive positions at Franklin. Schofield would make a defense here with his back to the Harpeth River, since he didn't have any pontoon boats to cross the river. Whether it was from his deteriorating health or his desire for revenge for the mistake he made at Spring Hill, Hood decided to make a frontal assault on the established Union breastworks. Nathan Bedford Forrest, Benjamin Cheatham, and Patrick Cleburne were all opposed to a frontal assault, but Hood persisted and ordered the charge to take place that afternoon, a decision that he has been roundly criticized for, in that the battle was not only a resounding defeat for Hood, but his decision, in the face of unanimous opposition, cost him 1,750 killed, including Generals Patrick Cleburne, Hiram Granberry, States' Rights Gist, Otho Strahl, and John Adams. General John Carter would die later from his wounds on December the 10th.
General Hood supposedly was hooked on or had the habit of laudanum, which is pretty much liquid opium. And he was blamed later on by being on opium, losing the siege of Atlanta and especially the charge of Franklin, because it began at Chickamauga, because they said that he probably started drinking laudanum and it really affected his decisions. A good friend of mine, Stephen Hood, who goes by Sam Hood, has evidence that that wasn't the case, that he was never hooked on laudanum. Hood wasn't. And there was papers from John Bell Hood that were not discovered till almost 100 years after the war, that he was never on laudanum.
After another bitter defeat in Nashville on December the 15th and 16th, 1864, Hood left with what was left of the Army of Tennessee to Tupelo, Mississippi, where he resigned on January the 23rd, 1865. Hood, still loyal to the Confederacy, left for Richmond to present a plan to return to Texas to recruit 25,000 troops. On his way, he stopped in Columbia, South Carolina to visit the Prestons and Chestnuts. There he found that his relationship with Buck had cooled. She'd been seeing Johnny Chestnut and Rollins Lowndes, the young, rich aide to Wade Hampton. Once in Richmond, Hood found himself and President Davis the focus of bitter attacks. Congress and the press were laying the blame for the Confederacy's failures at the feet of Hood and, by extension, Davis. Joe Johnston, who'd been put back in command of the Army of Tennessee, threatened to prefer charges against Hood, whereupon Hood requested a court of inquiry. General Samuel Cooper shut them both down, and Hood was ordered to proceed to Texas. He left Richmond for Texas in mid-March, and on his way stopped in Chester, South Carolina for another visit with the Prestons. Mary Chestnut reported in her diary that the Hood melodrama is over. While Hood was in Chester, Richmond would fall on April 2, 1865. The Prestons, including Sally, were preparing to leave for Paris. She would return after the war and marry Rollins Lowndes in 1868. Hood and his two aides left to continue their journey when the war ended. He surrendered in Natchez, Mississippi, and was immediately paroled. In June, he received a hero's welcome in Houston and San Antonio. The public didn't care about Atlanta, Franklin, or Nashville. He was the Hood who led the Texas Brigade at Gaines Mill, Manassas, and Sharpsburg. Hood would eventually make his home in New Orleans. With a $10,000 loan from his friends and family, he opened J.B. Hood and Company, cotton factors. Simon Buckner, Fighting Joe Wheeler, and James Longstreet all had businesses in New Orleans. On April the 13th, 1868, Hood married 19-year-old Anna Marie Hennon. Together, they would have 11 children. Hood initially supported the Southern Historical Society when it was founded in 1869 in Baton Rouge, but he made a quick reversal when it moved to Richmond and was taken over by Virginians, especially Jubal Early, who were keen on laying the blame for the lost cause on anybody except Virginians. They quickly took aim on James Longstreet and Hood. And once Joe Johnston wrote his biography, Hood responded saying, "There are hyenas in human form who stand ready to tear open the grave of the buried past and whet their insatiable appetites for revenge upon the slain heroes, and spit their venom on those who survive." Hood's memoirs, Advance and Retreat, Personal Experiences in the United States and Confederate Armies, published a year after his death, directly contradicts the myths of the Virginia-centric lost cause. Hood also supported the Hood's Texas Brigade Association, a group of survivors from his old brigade. He attended the first reunion held in Houston in 1872 and told attendees, "Comrades, you've done your duty nobly as soldiers. Continue to do your duty as nobly as citizens, trusting that God will someday give you that liberty which you claim as an inheritance from your forefathers." In 1878, the yellow fever epidemic hit New Orleans. Over 4,000 people lost their lives to the disease, including Hood's wife, Anna, who died on August 22, 1879. Hood contracted the disease on August 27th. He and his daughter Lydia would die on the same day, a week later on Saturday, August the 30th, 1879, and are buried with Anna in the Metairie Cemetery. Hood lost everything during the epidemic, and he left 10 destitute orphans that needed to be cared for. Former General P.G.T. Beauregard organized the Hood Orphan Publication Fund, which raised $30,000 to support the children and pay for their education. Beauregard also found homes for the children, who were adopted by 7 different families from Louisiana, New York, Mississippi, Georgia, and Kentucky. One of Hood's former soldiers, Sam Watkins, penned Hood's epitaph. But the half of brave Hood's body molders here. The rest was lost in honor's bold career. Though fame and limbs he scattered all around, yet still, though mangled was the glory crowned. Forever ready with his blood to part, war left him nothing whole except his heart.